All right, looks like we are underway. Everybody, thank you for joining me. My name is Greg Hurlman. I'm a developer at Microsoft on the Power Apps Component Framework team as part of the overall Power Platform organization. And I'm here to talk to you today about what's available for developers in the Power Platform. Specifically, I'm going to focus on two different opportunities for developers, both in the custom connector side, kind of like that data layer, and as you might imagine, as I'm on that team, using the Power Apps Component Framework to create new controls for your UI inside Power Apps. One note before we get started, everything I'm going to be talking about today is available for you to play with today. Custom connectors and custom controls are generally available for Power Apps. The custom UI controls are generally available for model-driven Power Apps and in public preview right now for canvas-based Power Apps. We will be going to general availability for those later on this year. At the end, I'll be sharing a bunch of links for various resources, and if you want to reach out to me afterward, I'll provide links for you to do that as well. But that said, this is a developer talk for developer stuff, so no slides. We'll go ahead and just jump right in. Let me move Teams over here and get it out of the way and share my screen. All right, this one. Put Teams back where I want it and get rid of this guy. All right. So I've got my screen shared out now. And what we're looking at is what you would get if you typed make.powerapps.com into your browser, hit enter. This is our homepage for the Maker portal. Just as a quick overview of where we're going, we're going to start at that data layer. So we're going to expand out the data menu here. And just a quick review. Entities is where you define all your CDS data if you want to define additional entities, and all the properties and forms and all that good stuff for CDS. That's where you'd go it. Option sets for your various dropdowns and such. Data flows and exporting to data lake. If you've got things involved with Azure, that's where you want to start. Connections is where you're going to get our out-of-the-box connections. Anytime I talk about customization, I want to talk about what's available for you out of the box. And every time I give one of these presentations, this number keeps rising. I always have to check and see where we're at when I give this presentation. And so I can say now that out of the box, we have over 300 different connectors to various cloud services that can give you data of various sorts. As you might imagine, everything from Microsoft is there. All the Office things, all the Microsoft 365 things, everything from Azure, everything from the Power Platform, of course. But as you can see, even in this top lift, we have Salesforce, we have Dropbox, on and on and on and on. It just keeps going. There's, like I said, 300 different connections. If there's a cloud service that a lot of folks have heard of, chances are we already have it set up. But sometimes it's not there. Sometimes you need your own custom connector. Maybe it's a cloud service that just hasn't gotten their connector set up with us yet. Maybe it's an API that is internal to your company that isn't public. Both very valid scenarios. Before we actually dive in, one last thing I'll take a look at here is our gateways. I don't have one set up, but if you have a SQL Server or an API endpoint internal to your organization, not in the cloud, actually living on a server on your internal network somewhere, you can still use those with the Power Platform. You just need to set up a data gateway, which is the in-between service that sits on the edge of your network that takes the incoming requests and proxies them back to your internal environment. We're not going to mess with those today, but that is available to you if you're thinking about internal APIs that you might want to set up. So we're going to actually click over to custom connectors, which I have in a tab already. And this is just my demo environment, so I have a few different custom connectors already set up. But these connectors are meant to be the go-between between the Power Platform and your API, or I shouldn't say your API, but another API outside the Power Platform. This can be certainly your APIs you control, but it can be other APIs as well. I have a few set up here already. We're going to go ahead and walk through what it looks like to create a new one. and we have a few options here. We're going to create one from scratch, from blank, right here at the start. But before I go through that, we'll look through the rest here. Creating from an Azure service, that's in preview right now. If you have an API that's set up through Azure API Management, you can click on this and point to that API from here. And API Management will tell the Power Platform everything it needs to know for that custom connector. You can import an OpenAPI or Swagger file. So if you have a Swagger file that describes your API, you can upload that, and we'll start with that. Same with this. If you have it posted on a URL somewhere that we can get to it, we can just give it a URL and do the same thing. And last but not least, if you have a Postman collection, if in your development you've been using Postman to go back and forth with your API, you've got a good collection built up of all your different scenarios, we can import that Postman collection, look at everything that's been going back and forth over your network traffic, and do our best to try to model the API on that. But that said, I'm going to click on Create from Blank here and start from absolute scratch. And I'm actually going to be not dealing with a demo API I've created. I'm going to be using the Marvel Developer API. I've got a tab open we're going to look at here in a moment. Marvel, the comic folks, not the movie folks, although they're very close, has an incredible free API with all sorts of information, and I would like to pull all of that in today. So I'm just going to call this connector Marvel and hit continue. The icon I won't mess with, the color I won't mess with. We can give it a description. These are all helpful for users when they're looking at all the connectors to see which one is yours. You want to match this to your branding or whatever. You would check this box if you were using one of those data gateways I talked about before. But let's go ahead and point to Marvel. I've got the developer portal up right here, and it's got a number of different API endpoints. If we click on one, we can see everything that it gives us. And we can also see that our server is right here. So I'm just going to copy that and paste it into the host. The host is just the server, not the path, and we don't need the SSL port on there. But the base URL is that /v1/public. Everything that we're going to talk to is going to start with that URL. And we put that in here so we don't have to keep defining that over and over as we go through picking out the bits of the API we want. We'll click on the next button here to get to security. And we have a few different options here. We can have no authentication. We don't really care. We're just going to let people use it. Basic authentication, usernames and passwords. API key authentication, that's what we're going to use here in a moment. And Oauth 2.0. I do want to take a moment and talk about Oauth 2.0. We do support generic Oauth. If you have your own Oauth service, if you got a third-party Oauth service, you can use the generic Oauth and set it all up. But if you click on the drop-down here, we have Azure Active Directory defined, as you might imagine, but also quite a few other Oauth supporters, where if your folks are logging in with Facebook, you can turn that on. If they're logging in with GitHub, you can turn that on as well, and so on down the line. We are not going to use Oauth today, though. We are going to use API key authentication. And that API key is usually when you make the query request to the API, they're just right there on the query string, so that's where we're going to put it. It's a variable called API key on the query string, and we'll put it on the query. This parameter label is going to show up as what the user is prompted when you first create a connection using this connector. It'll prompt the user at that time to provide that API key, and this is the label for that text box. You want this to be human readable. That out of the way, we will go to definition. Now I'll reach around my microphone to get some water, because a 42-year-old man cracking his voice just isn't right. All right, so first thing we want to do is create an action. Now these actions are going to be your API endpoints individually. If you want somebody to connect to an endpoint, that's what an action is. Now you can have more than one action per endpoint. If an endpoint does something differently depending on what HTTP verb you're using. So if you have one endpoint that serves both GET and POST, that would actually be two different actions inside inside your connector. I've got a question here. Can we read that API key from the CDS config custom entity? You can let's see, in here, we cannot. In here, this has to be actually defined inside the connection. One option, instead of providing it inside the connection itself, we can provide a policy. So we can provide our policy and name, and we can do a few different things. We can set a query string parameter here. So if we wanted to set our parameter called API key and provide the value here and leave the connection settings blank, we could make the backend API happy without having to have our users deal with providing an API key. So that is available to you as well. But as far as reaching back into the CDS to get something out, that's not something we can do right now. Let me clear out that policy real quick, go back to where we are here. So the very first action that we're going to take a look at is this top API right here. V1 public characters. It's just getting a list of characters given search parameters. So we will call this characters. We're going to get some characters. This is actually going to show up as a description for your users when they're using your connection. So you want to make that something that's helpful. And then an operation ID. This is going to be the name of the function inside Power Apps or Flow that that shows up for your users. So you want to make this that's somewhat readable. Don't make this a mile long. Don't start and don't make it too short that people don't know what they're looking at here. But we'll just call this characters, one word, pretty straightforward. Then the next one, visibility, I want to actually walk through a little bit because it's a little non-intuitive. First of all, the default visibility of none doesn't mean that it's not going to show up. None really means default. It's just going to be there. It's going to be in the list of operations in alphabetical order if you don't do anything else, and that can be okay. Advanced, if we set that, is going to put it below the fold, so to speak, in your API operations. This is more of a Power Automate thing than a Power Apps thing. If you're using this inside Power Automate, a user will see all the operations available to them, and then they'll see a link to see more. If something is marked as advanced, it's going to be behind that see more click. So this will be to hide operations that most users won't use, but you want to have available. Internal means that this is going to be there. It'll be there as part of your connector, but it will not be listed to end users. So if you want to have that, maybe that's not quite ready yet, you can mark it as internal. And then important just means this operation is going to be pushed to the very top. It won't be in alphabetical order. It will jump up to the top of the list and maybe you want to do that for operations that your users are going to be using all the time. I will just leave it as a default. It can just be there. So that's no big deal here. The very first thing we need to do is define our request. When we send a request to the server, what does that request look like? So to define that, we click on import from sample, and we get various options to define what that request looks like. Now for this one, it is a get, and the endpoint is just called characters. I'll just double click. Yep, it's just characters. So I'll provide that characters. But we actually want the whole URL query string in all, so we're not going to include that. We are going to include all the parameters here. Now I have gone through and found this out, but in order to get all the parameters inside a URL from our documentation, let's go ahead and fill in nonsense just to get ourselves a URL. So 0000 define variables and click on try it out. That'll get all our variables. We will highlight that, copy it, and paste it in here. There are no special headers that we need, so we'll leave that blank and we'll click import. And so the UI has figured out exactly, grabbed all those query string variables and put them in here. One thing it did grab as well is that API key. Now that's going to be passed along automatically by our security setup, so we don't need that. We can just click on the 3 dots there and click delete. And one other thing that you might want to specify is it's modified since. It needs to be a date time. So we'll click on edit. the only thing I can really pick out is that it was a string, and it is a string, but we can tell it that this particular string is a date time, and in the Power Apps or Power Automate UI, it'll treat that field as a date time from your app makers, just to give them a little more strongly typed information. Excuse me. So we modified that. We'll click this back button, not this back button, not this back button, this back button, so you don't lose what you're doing. All right, so we have our query with all our parameters up here. You can mark some of these as required if you want. I don't think any of these are. And just to answer the question in the chat, I believe all of these recordings are going to be posted on YouTube eventually. It may be a little bit after the event, but keep up with the organizers; they should be able to tell you. So as we proceed down, we've defined a request. Now we need to define our response. We have a default response given to us out of the box in case we want just something for quick testing. I'll double click on that and get into it. And we have a key body output that is basically just going to take everything returned in the body of the response and dump it into one big string. We can do better than that, and we're going to import from a sample. Now again, we're going to leave headers blank, and so we need an example JSON that we're going to get back from our API. So we'll go back to the Marvel site here. We'll come back up and we'll clear out most of these just so we can get a response. And turn that off. I think that's everything it is. And try it out one more time. Much shorter URL. This time we have a response body we can use. So we will copy that response body and everything else that came with it. Hit Control-C and Control-V right in here to dump in that JSON response and click Import. And that gets back all the information that comes back as part of that JSON response, figures out types, figures out the structure of it, and dumps it all in here for us to use. I'm not going to mess with any of this. I will leave it alone, and everything looks valid. That's great. We'll go to testing. Now we do need to save it once before we go through testing, so I'll click on Create Connector to create that backend connector. All right. Now we can't test it here because we don't have a connection based on this connector yet. So I'll click on New Connection. It does ask for an API key, which I'll copy back out of here. Don't worry about this key. This key is only good for this session, and then I'll refresh it. It's a free service. You can get your own anyway. But we'll paste it into the API key and click Create. So that adds a connection. Unfortunately, it does dump us back into the Connections UI out from where we were. Now, if I hit the back button, it'll bring us to our custom connectors screen. Click on the Edit button for the Marvel API and come back to test where we were before. This time, it finds our selected connection and unlocks our operation to test. So let's see if we have all the characters starting with spider and click test. See what comes back. And we have our response 200 OK with a ton of information coming back. Everything looks good. OK. So I will save my connector one more time. And the connector should be ready to use. Now, one more thing I want to point out is maybe you have that Swagger file. Maybe you do more work on your API later and have a Swagger file for it, or you're just more comfortable making changes inside Swagger instead of clicking around in this UI. That's okay too. We have this Swagger editor right here at the top. If I go back to the definition screen here, you don't have to, but I just make it easier. Click on this toggle to switch us to Swagger mode. And if you've done development before with Swagger, this will look very familiar. This is kind of the out-of-the-box Swagger API documentation you get for the APIs defined. This actually is Swagger in YAML format, YAML. Yet another markup language. Not my favorite, but is what it is. But I can do a little better than that. I have in Visual Studio Code right now my this connection set up in a Swagger file in JSON format, the format I like, just a little bit better. One difference, though, we have our characters endpoint that we just set up manually. This one has two more, one for comics based on a character, and then getting more comic information based on a comic ID. And one thing I want to point out is when you're setting up your connection URL and you want to specify an input parameter that actually is built into the URL itself, not as part of the query string, you just put it inside these curly brackets. That'll add another parameter as part of the query. But I will just take this entire Swagger JSON, copy it, and then come over here and replace the YAML with JSON. When I paste it in, it'll ask me, do you want to convert your JSON into YAML? If you say no, it just won't paste it in. If you say yes, it will paste it in and convert it. So I will say yes. I will accept it because it keeps me from having to write YAML for this stuff, which is pretty great. And we see we have all of our operations in here. But now I've made these changes. Do I need to save it before I go back to the other view? I do not. I can just turn it off. And our actions are otherwise ready to go as if I had typed them in here. And just as I said, in the URL, we have this character ID. And then that's just added to our path parameters that users are asked for at runtime. So now that we've got those added as well, I will update the connector. Watch our little circles of patience. All right, that looks like it's good to go. And that should be our connection to the Marvel API. Now in a tab here, I already have preloaded a Power App that is set up to use that API. There's a lot of errors because the connection to the API is missing right now, so we'll add that in. These users, if you go to your data sources and we can search for our custom connector. Oh, you know what? It's not finding it because I created it after I opened up this screen. So what I will do, I'll just close out this tab and reopen it. That's okay. We'll go up to Apps, click on the three dots and edit. Wait for Power Apps to do its thing. If anybody's got a question on anything that we've done so far, feel free to put them into the chat and I will try to answer them for you. All right, spinning circles of patience, and we're back, same errors, but it should find our connection now. So if I type Marvel in here, there it is. So I will click on it. It already has the connection that we set up in the testing. We'll just reuse that. And Marvel is added to our application. Now we still have these errors because we need to set this up. What we need to do when somebody clicks go, we need to look at what somebody's typed in here and query our API, dump those responses into a collection. So I will call clear collect. I will create a collection called characters. And I will call the Marvel API marvel.characters. And you can see in here all the parameters that we set up in that connection. Everything that's inside a curly brace, is optional for a user to use. If something is required, it'll show up as a required parameter outside these curly braces. But we don't have any of those. We will go ahead and provide name starts with, and we will point to our text box, which I think is just text input 1. Yeah, it is. Do better than me when you're writing your apps and actually rename your controls into something useful. So we're going to take the text from that text box and we're going to pass it in. All right, so that is the Marvel characters call. So now if I hit dot, it actually dives into the parameters that we've said that we're going to get back from that connector, a whole bunch of stuff. Our results are actually inside the data parameter, and inside there, sorry, I can't talk today, the results collection. So that is going to be what we call, and I'll hit enter just to kind of save that inside that configuration and hit play to see what we're working here. Actually, before I do that, And something that's going to be super useful, even with your out-of-the-box connectors, but definitely useful for your custom connectors under Advanced Tools, is the Power Apps Monitor. This is fairly new. Sometime in the last few months, this was released into preview, experimental preview. If you click on Open Monitor, it'll open up another tab, and this will give you more information, more developer-y, kind of fiddler-y type information for the back and forth that's going on in the background. So we'll open that up, just keep that in the background here, and run this app so we can give it a shot. And so if we type the character name, we find all the spider people and hit go. See our dots of patients across the top, and we're getting all this good information back from that API in our monitor. You can see the set properties running across as I was typing, and then our network call. If I click on that, we can see the data that's involved with that network call. We can see the request that was sent out. Now, keep in mind, the URLs are always going to be to Power Apps, and then we turn around and call your API. So that's what you want to look at here. We don't show you the server, but we do show you the query string. So we're calling /characters, and we're passing name starts with spider. The response is straight from your API though. So we're getting a whole bunch of headers. We're getting our body data results, and that's what we're showing inside our collection. So we have that. Why don't we go ahead and take a look at Spider Ham, making another API call to see all the comics Spider Ham was involved in. And we can dig into Spider Ham #1 and take a look at that cover. Pretty good looking cover. But I wanted to see maybe the cover doesn't have the UPC on there. Power Apps has a UPC reader control out of the box, but not a UPC display control. So why don't we add that in here? If I close that up and scroll that down, we will add that to our application. And that has already been deployed as a Power Apps component framework control. So we'll add that in, and then we'll actually see what it looks like to build one of those. Underneath custom import component. Oh, it doesn't want to work. All right, so here's what I'm going to do, because that has been flaky. I'm going to go ahead. Oh, I should save my changes. And then I'm going to close the app, and then I'm going to reopen the app. And then after this call, I'm going to send emails and fuss at people. But that's okay. All right, we have our app reopened. Let's go ahead and run it just to populate the screens again, just a little easier to see things when we've done that. So search for spider, click into Spider Ham, click on Spider Ham #1. All right, so that's the screen we're on. We'll try one more time. Under Insert, Custom Import Component. Oh gosh, it just doesn't want to today. Okay, I will. You know what I'll do? I will try it inside a different browser. We'll bring up Edge. If something wants to work, it should work in Edge. Sorry for this, folks. This isn't even the part that I'm trying to show you. This is the part that gets me to that part. This is the wrong. You know what? I will open up a private mode Edge, just because we don't need to be logging into the internal Microsoft version. Let's add grhurl.on. Pardon me as I log into my demo tenant here. Stay signed in, sure. Pin it and unpin that there. Okay. So we'll open up one more time. Actually, we'll just go down to Marvelator, say edit. It's already open. That's okay. We'll open it here. Yeah, and somebody is pointing out I should close my app before I open it. Otherwise, Power Apps gets unhappy. Is true, but I am horrible at doing that. What is go straight to Spider Ham? All right. Okay, one more shot. And if this doesn't work, we'll just dive into the code for these things. But this is the flow. Go to custom, import component. All right. And this panel shows up, and it shows up and it stays there for you to pick something. Now there are two different kinds of components. Canvas components are going to be your out-of-the-box bunch of out-of-the-box Power Apps controls, grouped together, configured to work as one control. That is a Canvas component. Code components are going to be components that have been deployed to your environment based on the Power Apps component framework. And I will choose barcode control, which has already been deployed, and click import. And what that will do is add this control to the application, but not to the individual screen. To add the actual control, I have to go to the plus menu here on the side underneath code components and say, I want a barcode control. Now that got added to the wrong spot, so I'm going to cut that out. I'm going to paste it inside the card here and do that. So it is there. It doesn't have any value, so it doesn't have any UI. Let's just do a quick test here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, so that is showing a barcode. So I will point it to the UPC symbol for this particular comic, and it's there, and it just works. Okay, so that was a lot of refreshing and opening Power Apps over and over, but after, hopefully it's a bug will get fixed. In the meantime, one thing I want to point out before we dive into code is that as an app maker, it doesn't matter to me. I don't need to know HTML. I don't need to know CSS. I don't need to know React. I don't need to know JavaScript. I don't need to know any of it. I just need to know that I import a component and then I add it to my screen and that it works. I don't need to know any of it that developers do to make this control happen. And that's really the power of Power Apps Component Framework controls, is that they work alongside out-of-the-box controls. They look and feel like out-of-the-box controls. And so you're really empowering your app makers with these controls. But let's look at what it actually looks like to create that kind of control. I will open up a command line and look at what I've got here. What I have inside my demo directory is an empty directory except for node modules. You do to create these components, you do need Node and NPM installed. They are based on JavaScript technologies, TypeScript in particular. You don't have to use TypeScript, but we do very much encourage it. And as part of that, there are Node modules you need to download. I've kept them here just so you don't need to sit here for a few minutes and watch that download happen. So otherwise, it's an empty folder. One other thing that you need to install is the Power Apps CLI or PAC. I'll just run that without any parameters on it so you can see what's in here. This can do a number of different things. You can authenticate to your environments to help push things out. You can run this help. You can work with the Power Apps Component Framework. We're going to be digging into that shortly. You can create CDS plugins through here. You can create CDS solution projects through here. And you can turn telemetry on and off. If you don't want to be sending Microsoft telemetry, we don't collect what it is you're creating, just the fact that you created something. But if you don't want to send that telemetry, you just say PAC telemetry disable, and it turns it off. I am going to create a Power Apps component framework project, and I do that with the PAC PCF init, and I have to pass in a couple of parameters. I do have to create a namespace, so we'll just call this demo controls. Why not? We have to give it a name, so we will call this demo, super original, and we have to give it a template. Now, right now, it can be the template can be field, or it can be dataset. So the difference between field and dataset really depends on what kind of data that you want to bind to. Field is going to be data that is only individual fields. a text value, a number value, a Boolean, whatever. If you specify data set, that's when you're going to be talking about groups of data. You're going to have rows. You're going to be binding to items. You're going to be binding to objects. You're going to be binding to rows and columns of data. Data set is the template you want. We're not going to get into that today, though. We will just stick with field. It's pretty straightforward. And run that. And that runs just that quickly. It tells you to run npm install. I've already done that. So I will just pop this open in Visual Studio Code and see what got created. All right. So we have our big empty window, and we have our project that got dumped in. Our node modules are there. Our demo project is really what we're looking at. At our root, we have a few different JSON files for defining how TypeScript does its thing, how PCF is configured. Right now is just an out directory. You might as well leave that alone unless you super care about which directory the build outputs to. Our package.json file, this is a straight out of the box, not out of the box, but a very normal node package.json file. This is where you define what libraries you want to pull in. You're free to pull in any third-party JavaScript library you want to, and you just specify it in here. We do have an npmrc, which will actually not be there for you. That's just because I'm running an internal version. Sorry about that. We have a git ignore to ignore the normal things, and we have this PCF proj file that looks very much like a lot of other kind of Visual Studio-y project files. Generally, you should never have to touch what's in here. And I will first jump to inside our demo folder, the control manifest input file. This is going to define a whole bunch of data about your control. So we already have our namespace and name that we gave you, our version 0.0.1. We do semantic versioning up to 3 different version numbers. So if you put on a 4th version number, we're not going to pay any attention to it. So you may as well leave it off. Display name key and description key is going to be the display name and description for the control inside the UI. They're named for keys rather than just saying display name and description because they are localizable. Your controls can support multiple languages if you so choose to do so. You just have to specify a Microsoft localization file, a .resx or resx file. And if you do that, you would point to the kind of the named key for that text rather than the text itself. And then control type is standard. Right now, standard is the only control type that we support, so leave that as standard. And then we give you properties that you're going to bind to. Right now, we have sample property. I'll actually change that to name because we're going to do a hello worldy sort of scenario here. Display name and description. When we give that something a little better, we'll just call this name, and its description is the name, because again, super useful, super creative. We do have to specify the type of property here. Now, in a Canvas Power App, this type really doesn't matter. In a model-driven Power App, this type does matter, because if you're replacing the visualization for a text field, we're only going to show you the text type controls for that field. So something to keep in mind, that you want to make sure that you don't just put text all the time, that you do keep this for numbers or dates or whatever else. You do need at least one bound control, and it doesn't have to be required if you're going to be replacing a not required field. So that can be true or false as well. Now, there's a comment here that explains how you can use type groups instead of type. So you can say of type group here and point to, in this case, numbers. So if you don't really care what kind of number, you want a whole number, a currency, a floating point, a decimal, you don't really care, just give me a number. You can say of type group numbers, and you can bind to any one of these types. Something to keep in mind. Down here in resources, we point to the different files that we're going to be gathered up into your application. You do have to point to code files, but you don't have to point to every single code file. The way we use Webpack to build everything, and what we do is walk the tree of code files referring to other code files, starting with the kind of roots of the tree that you specify here. So if everything that you're including is referred to from index or referred to in things that index itself refers to, and so on, you only have to specify the root of the tree here. You do have to specify if you're going to have CSS files, if you're going to have image files, if you're going to have those resx files, you have to specify those here as well, so that they're all bundled up together. And then down here is our feature usage section that you should use if you're using things that will take advantage of device capabilities. Now, this is going to be if your app is deployed to a phone or tablet. These are permissions to do things like capture the audio from the microphone, capture an image or a video from the camera. Get barcode value is very specific. I think it just is also for the camera. Get current position is location data. Pick file, it's going to be the file picker if the device supports it, and then other various utility and web API functions you have to specify in here. If you don't specify the feature when you want to use it, when it comes time to actually call the API to get that information, not only are you not going to get that information, but the function itself will be null. There'll be no function for you to call, so keep that in mind. But we changed that sample property to name, so I'm going to save this file. So I've got a question here. Should the usage be set to bound even if only displaying and visualizing data, not changing any field data? By default, for model-driven apps, at least one bound field is required, and that's because in a model-driven app you can't have free-floating controls. You have to replace the out-of-the-box visualization for a value with a control. For Canvas-based Power Apps, that is not the case. So keep that in mind, that you do the bound field is less about what if you're giving data back to the server, and more about which field is going to be given its information from the field you're binding to, if that makes sense. Hopefully it makes sense. If it doesn't, follow up in the chat and I'll try to do better to explain it. Maybe you want to get to actually what this looks like inside a model-driven app. It'll make it a little bit more sense. So we have our control manifest input, and one thing that is defined from that is our manifest types. Now these are types that an interface that we define so you can talk about the properties in your manifest from your code. Now right now these are still set to sample property. If I pop open my command line real quick, we're going to run npm run build and have it run a quick build on the code that we have so far. So the first thing that it'll do is actually read that manifest, make sure everything in that manifest makes sense and is valid, and it will generate those manifest types. So if we bounce back into Visual Studio Code here, you'll see that sample property has changed to name, and we can go ahead and code against name now in our code. And index.ts is kind of where all the magic happens. This is our component at the end of the day. So we're importing those types from that manifest types. The very first thing we have here is an empty constructor. This constructor should stay empty. You don't know when this particular class is going to be instantiated. It's not necessarily going to be the first time your control is getting ready to be loaded on a screen. So leave your constructor blank. What you want to do, anything you would normally put it into in a constructor, you want to put into this init function. This is going to be where you set up maybe initial UI. This is going to be where you kick off network calls. This is going to be where you set up, do all your setup. And we pass in a few different parameters here. Let me just go ahead and get them all here so we can see them. All right. What am I doing? Okay. So we have 4 different parameters we're passing in here. The first, context, is going to be your kind of gateway to the rest of the API. So if I type in context dot, you can see all the different directions the API goes in. We can get client information, device information. We have some factory functions in here, formatting information. You can information about the mode of your application, if it's running on a phone or tablet or in the web. Navigation APIs, parameters is where we're going to get information from the types that are coming back and forth. Resources, if you are localizing your code and you have resource files, you get your information through that. And some more, and it goes on and on. I'm not going to go all the way through it, but context you're going to use quite a bit. Notify output changed is a callback that we give you. If you're going to have users, if you have a component that users are not just looking at information with, if you're going to have a component where users are changing information, a slider, for example, you want to hold on to notify output changed. Save it inside a local instance variable so you can refer to it later, so that when somebody changes a value using your control can pick up that information and then call notify output changed. When you call notify output changed, the framework gets that call and does a few different things, and then we'll turn around and call get outputs. And that's when you would return your values to the server. So if you have, in this case, we have name as our parameter, you would pass it whatever the logic says the name is going to be, and so on. We're not going to be doing that today. We're just going to be doing display today. So, but that's notify output changed. We do have state. It's just an empty dictionary that we give you if you have state information you want to hold on to and you're not using something like React or anything else. You would use state. And then we have container, which is just our wrapper div. We're basically giving you an empty div and then telling you fill that div with your component. So we give you the div. One comment in the chat here: how do you get CDS context and information in Power Apps without using a control? So inside Power Apps, you do use a connector of sorts, but it's not really a connector. Oops, wrong window. If I jump back in here real quick. Oh, I had it in the other browser, right? So if you want to look at CDS information underneath here, you just go straight to entities, and this is going to pull up your entities inside the same environment. So if I wanted to pull up contacts, I could just jump straight in here and connect to my contacts entity and get my CDS data. You can make API calls inside your component code against the CDS. That is certainly allowed and possible. How do you get the current CRM URL and so on? That is something that we're looking at. I don't have that right in front of me. There is an API that you can call inside a Power App, a Canvas-based Power App. There is no CRM, so to speak. There is just a CDS on the back end. If you're running inside a model-driven app, there might be a CRM, there might not be. Remember, model-driven isn't just dynamics anymore. But you can use code that is reaching out to test against those APIs before you use them. But the Power Apps component framework is kind of CRM agnostic in that you can use it inside CRM, but we're aiming for a control that'll work inside model-driven, canvas-driven, dynamics or not dynamics, without any extra code for the users. For needing those APIs in Power Apps, if you're not getting what you need from the CDS native connectors there, reach out to me after the call, and I'll see if I can get those questions answered for you. But right now, because we're doing something pretty straightforward, I actually don't build out my UI inside init. I just kind of set things up, and what I will do first is actually just create a variable called container, and it's going to hold on to my container. And I will just say this container, and that'll be it for my init, because down here in update view is where I'm actually going to build our UI. Update view is called directly after init on first load, and update view is called again every time something happens in the UI that we feel like your control should know about, because it might want to re-render. If an underlying value changes on the server that you are bound to, we're going to call update view. If the phone has been turned sideways, and now the size of the screen is different. We're going to call update view. If somebody has changed the size of their web window, we're going to call update view, and so on. So this is your chance to make UI changes based on things that happened outside your code. So this is where I like to build my UI initially. So I can say this dot the container dot inner text, because we are doing super hello world. We'll just say hello world, and that's it. The very last function that we have in here is destroy. This is going to be like our destructor. So this is going to be cleanup code. You want to cancel any network connections you have open. You want to unhook any event handlers that you have maybe created. This is your last chance to avoid any memory leaks before we unload your application. But this is pretty straightforward. So what I will do is I can build it again and it'll build, but that doesn't really show us what we want to see. So I will run npm start watch. And what that does is actually builds out the application and then loads our local debug harness. Now you don't need to deploy to the server over and over to test it. You can test it locally inside our environment. And we can see right now that it didn't work. I missed something in my demo. Oh, you know what? I didn't save it. So how about I save it? And what we'll see here is that the change was detected because we are actually running in watch mode. So if we pull this up again, without refreshing, because it's already been refreshed for us, we see hello world. Now we are getting our name property and we're not actually responding to it. Val is just our default value we give you for text properties. So we should probably do something with that property. And that is as straightforward as going back into our code here. And instead of saying hello world, we can string interpolation here and say hello context. Oops. Context dot parameters dot. If I can, I've completely lost my prompt there. Dot name, and you want dot name is not actually what you're looking for here. Name is an object that tells us more about your property, not the data itself. So we hit dot, and in this case we're going to use raw. There is a formatted value here also. So if you have maybe a currency property that's going to be formatted nicely for you, you might maybe want to use that for your UI. I'll just jump into raw here and save it and come back into our sandbox, and you can see hello val. So I can say, and it updates as the data comes in. So that is your hello world out of the box. Now, one thing I want to show you is something else we can do. That barcode code itself, we've got a few minutes left. So I switch into that directory and bring that up in Visual Studio Code. And what this looks very, very familiar. There's a few more things going on. If you're using React, we're going to pull in our React component type and our props from our React code file. We're going to pull in React and React DOM from those libraries. Inside init, we're going to set up our container, our container style, and then our React properties. Inside update view, we're going to follow that same pattern as if you've seen in the React docs, React without JSX. And in this case, we're going to say React DOM.render, and inside there, React create element, passing in our type and our barcode props, and then putting it inside the container that we've been using. And inside destroy, we're going to say React DOM unmount component at node, and pointing back to that container DOM. And then inside React barcode, it's .tsx file. It's pretty straightforward React code if you've done that. All it's doing is setting some default properties and using JS barcode to actually create that barcode file, and then rendering out one of these three images depending on what the browser supports. Easy peasy. So that if we go back to here, maybe we can run npm run watch here as well. always do that. npm start watch. That will spin and do its thing sooner or later. Grab a coffee and come back. All right. So in our developer harness here, we have our control. And the reason I wanted to bring this up is for our dev tools. Let's actually just dock that to the right. So we can see inside our debugger what's going on. If I make a little more room here, everything is compiled with Webpack. And if we look at our barcode directory, we have our index.ts file, we have our tsx file. So we can hit a breakpoint right here for update view, so that if the view changes, you can see that it hits our breakpoint right away. We're going to build out the new React element based on the new properties we're going to pass in. I'll just hit save, and that updates. Pretty straightforward. But one thing to point out is that the debugging experience is just the browser tools, and it's pretty straightforward. It's going to do the source maps and everything for you when you compile in debug mode. You can also compile it in production mode, where it's not going to create source maps, and it's going to bundle everything up all small and all that good production stuff. But that is PCF in a nutshell, and it allows your users to create things like this. So a pretty straightforward app, but we've covered custom connectors. We covered PCF in a nutshell, but let me give you a couple links real quick. One question right here: what add-ins do we find helpful for developing PCF and VS Code? You don't need anything specifically for us. I have a ton of things. I use a bunch of stuff, but as far as what I would use in here is probably TSLint. That is going to help you with your TypeScript errors. Aside from that, maybe if you have a debuggers for your browser of choice, if you want to do your debugging inside Visual Studio Code, but you really don't need all that much. So does this barcode control support PDF 417, which I'm guessing is a kind of barcode? And for that, I don't know off the top of my head. I don't know enough about barcodes to really know. You'd have, if the JS barcode library out there in open source supports it, then I would say yes. But for references real quick, I'll just put it in here. You can go to aka.ms/pcfdocs. aka.ms pcfdocs is going to be our documentation. That's where you're going to get everything about the Power Apps Component Framework overview, sample code, tutorials. It's all there. And fairly new off the presses, if you go to aka.ms/learn-pcf, that'll bring us out to our learning modules that we have around PCF. That'll get you started as well. And then last but not least, you can go to aka.ms/pcf forum ? And that'll send you out to our forum that a lot of folks are in our MVP community. Folks from the product team are on here all the time, helping folks deal with all things pro developer on top of the Power Platform. So that's custom connectors, that's PCF, that's plugins, that's everything. But that is my time at this point. So unless I can hang out after for any other questions, but that will do it, I think, for our time today. Does anybody have any other questions before we go? Oh, the other two URLs, let me just put into the chat real quick. It's aka.ms/pcfdocs for documentation, and then aka.ms/pcf forum for the dev forums. And that's not just the community. Like I said, it's the product team as well. If you find bugs, if you find issues, you can put them in here. We'll help you out. Other than that, that is my time plus a minute. Thank you all so very much for joining me. If you have any other questions, you can find me, either go to aka, I can just put it in here too, aka.ms/Greg. That'll get me that's my Power Platform community page. You can send me messages from there, or you can always catch me on Twitter at twitter.com/98codes. I am on there all the time, probably a little bit too much. Otherwise, that's it for me. Thank you, everybody, and have a good day. All right. Support, I guess you can go ahead and stop the recording at this point. And